Cool, where to start? First of all, thank you all for attending. Thank you for having me. This is by no means a formal lecture, so I do encourage asking questions. The way I see this working out is I'm going to introduce myself, let you know who I am, let you know a bit about my influences, basically from the time I was that high to around about now, and basically how I kind of felt my way through my journey. And then over to the meat and potatoes, we'll go into my actual work, discuss some of my projects, what I was thinking, what I was on when I did that stuff. And then, yeah, I think at the end, you guys can ask questions. So please jot questions as we go by and be sure to fire them my way towards the end. Cool. So, hi, my name is Ndumiso. I draw and I animate, and I also get paid for it. I'm sure that's what you're all doing here, to try and figure out how to do that. So a little bit more about myself. I'm an award-winning illustrator, animator, and creative director with 14 years of professional experience. Like all of you sitting here, I also attended a tertiary institution. I obtained my BTech in multimedia design at the University of Johannesburg back in 2010. I'm not about to calculate how old you guys were back then, so I'll just kind of keep it to myself. But I actually started working as an intern back in 2009. I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. Some of my career highlights include being chosen as one of Design Indaba's emerging creatives when I was still a student, attending the Annecy Animation Festival in France, and winning a gold Craft Loerie for illustration a few years ago. I've worked on projects with brands such as Disney, Cartoon Network, Comedy Central, Coca-Cola, and I recently collaborated with Fly Safair. You'd know my girl Z was also part of that. And I recently collaborated with Freedom of Movement. So I actually have, I won't call it a clothing line, but like a little t-shirt collaboration that's available for sale right now. Cool, so that's a bit about me. Then on to my influences. So early creative influences and an obsession with comics. This is obviously my early years. My interest in art started when I was just a kid. I realized I could draw when I started getting good grades and winning art competitions, junior art competitions. What really drove my interest in art was the comics and cartoons I was exposed to. I was lucky enough to be a kid in the 90s, which I'm assuming none of you here were, right? Oh, there we go, yeah. Yeah, apparently the 90s was like the golden era of cartoons. It really was. And, you know, some of you may not know who that is. That would be Samurai Jack, the amazing work of Genndy Tartakovsky. So I was hooked on his stuff. Dexter's Lab, I'm sure you guys might be familiar with. Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, Two Stupid Dogs. Like, that was the golden era of cartoons, and that's what I used to watch. Same was true for comics. I think every weekend my brother and I would be like, you know, when's the next issue of Hulk coming out? Or, you know, Daredevil, Batman, X-Men, not so much Avengers. I don't vibe with Captain America. He's weak sauce. And definitely no Superman. That's my vibe. Batman all the way. But yeah, that was me at an early age. And it's not like, you know, I'd see this stuff and be like, hey, I want to draw. I just thought it was cool. I liked drawing this stuff. So that's another thing I did as a kid. I was a normal kid. I played outside and stuff. But like after watching Captain Planet, I'm assuming you guys know who that is, I'd literally into my sketch pad, draw him, then I'd go outside and play. And that was the vibe all the time. So that was me in comics and cartoons at an early stage. Then varsity vibes, which is basically where you guys are at. So modernism, traditional graphic design, and art house. In university, my understanding of design, film, and art was formalized. In our history of art module, I was introduced to the modernism art movement of the early 1900s. I was obsessed with the geometric layouts and minimalism of the Bauhaus and constructivism posters. Have you guys covered that stuff? And do you find it, or am I just being like a total nerd here? That's fine, I'll take it, yeah? But that was my thing. My mind was blown. The fact that people were using just these geometric shapes, using negative space, using simple colors to come up with like these interesting compositions that had depth, you know, so much intricacy, but just with these simple ingredients. For me, that just completely blew my mind. I was also introduced to film. So I had this one interesting lecturer, Syrian. In fact, let me rewind. So I didn't even study illustration like you guys. I studied multimedia design, and my sort of area of expertise was web design. So back then, that's when like web design was, considered, the rage. That's how you're going to make cash. And I remember this was like in 2007. I think they actually flew in one of the first UX guys to come and like chat to us. And he was like, yeah, he charges like 2,000 Rand an hour. And I was like, this is where I want to be, So web was very much my thing. My brother's an illustrator, who some of you might know. So he'd always like kind of nudge me on the side and be like, hey man, remember how we used to draw Captain Planet and all the cool stuff? Don't you want to do this? And I'm like, nah man, I'm looking at the money, this is where it's at. So I constantly had people like, kind of trying to sway me towards illustration and animation. With animation, I had this one lecturer, Sarian Kirsch. I think she's with Nemisa, and she sometimes guest lectures at AFDA. And she basically had this DVD library. Yeah, again, I don't know if you guys know what DVDs are, but hey. And yeah, it was literally just art house film. I remember the first conversation she and I had. She was like, oh, what's your favorite movie? And I was like, oh, it's Gladiator by Ridley Scott. And I felt quite deep saying this. And she was like, oh. And like she poked holes in it. And she's like, this was wrong with, this work. I found this wrong with his character. Like you're forced to feel sympathy for him and stuff like that. And I was like, initially I didn't agree. But over time, because then she obviously came back and suggested stuff. She was like, check out Ridley Scott's other work, like Blade Runner, for example. See what's going on there. And that completely opened up, my mind. Again, still wasn't trying to be an illustrator, but there's certain things I started to understand, like how stories are told. I think those were the early stages of me understanding storyboards, even though I wasn't actually creating storyboards. So yeah, a bit about my university life. The poster you see there is done in, so it's called Constructivism. It's actually a poster from a movie called Man with the Movie Camera. I don't know if you guys have heard of that movie. So that was shot even before my time. So in 1929 by Dziga Vertov, Russian filmmaker. And all he did, you can imagine, like filmmaking was like this novel idea back then. All he did was literally get a camera and just like, mission around Ukraine and Russia, just capturing everyday footage. And again, that also just blew my mind. That combined with like the constructivism, I was like, hey, I like what's happening here. Right, then it came about African consciousness. So finding inspiration in tradition, culture, and heritage. So I'm Ndebele, for those of you who don't know. And for the longest time, I've been fascinated with Ndebele house paintings, beadwork, and even other forms of African art. So like, your artifacts and your masks and that sort of thing. I've just always found it interesting, whether it's the geometric shapes, it's the symmetry, that stuff gets me excited. It was only after studying European art, which at the time I actually thought was like the epitome of art, that I started to draw similarities between African and European art. I found similarities in their use of geometry, symmetry, repetition, and color. But what made African art more appealing to me was that, unlike the functional aesthetic of Euro art, Afro art had intricate stories kind of woven into it. So I, really vibed with that. And that's obviously an example of Ndebele house paintings and Ndebele art. Cool, then on to my internship years. So this is around 2009, 2010. Learning the ways of the industry and how to keep a visual diary. So I've specifically highlighted that word. I'll go into detail around that. So in 2009, I was fortunate enough to land an internship at an illustration studio called Am I Collective. I don't know if you guys have heard about them. They've since rebranded. They're now called Bewilder TV. And I think their focus is more like motion. But like back then, they were like the mecca of like African illustration. Cool, where was I? Right, it was there that I met one of my biggest influences, Chris Hewitt, better known as Kronk. I don't know if you guys have heard of an illustrator named Kronk. So back in like 2009, 2010, this guy was like, he was doing it all. And this was before social media. He had a deal with Kid Robot, and he was basically creating, I don't know if you guys have heard of Kid Robot. They make like, I think they're called the Dunnies and the Monies, these little artists, collectible toys, but people don't want to call them toys, but they're toys. So he had that, and for me that was mind-blowing. As a South African illustrator working with a UK, toy manufacturer. And I think the thing that blew my mind was that he'd create these toys and they wouldn't even be available locally because they'd sell out like in minutes. And I was fortunate enough to find myself in Cape Town, interning and kind of job shadowing this guy. So you can imagine, I was just constantly like, just gazing at the guy and just, not doing anything. So he was a big deal. But I mean, there's many things he taught me along the way. He taught me, I'm trying to think off the cuff. He did tell me to always I should believe my own hype. I think that's something that's kind of stuck with me. And I think as illustrators, you have, someone once said this to me, it's either you have imposter syndrome or you're like the ultimate like narcissist and you're like, and it's this hardcore pendulum swing between the two. I always found myself, in the space of the imposter, like, oh, is my work really that good? I don't know if any of you guys suffer from that, but, chatting to him, he was like, dude, you shouldn't be worried if people are going to like your work or not. Just get high off your own supply, do your own stuff and be like, hey, this is cool, and call it a day. But the one super important thing that I learned from Kronk was keeping a visual diary. So kind of similar to like a journal or any diary, the only difference here is that you're not actually writing. You're actually it's like scrapbooking. You're taking stuff that you like and you're basically putting it in there. So this obviously happened before social media was a thing. So I'd literally create folders and I would find out the names of illustrators. I'd save out their work, like screenshots, and I'll just pop it in there. And it became an addiction. I'll show you how bad it's gotten. And yeah, this is one of my favorite illustrators, Toma Hanuka. He's an Israeli illustrator. I don't know if you guys are familiar with his work. So for me, what really just, again, blew my mind was his use of color. Like, this guy was doing color like nobody else. And yeah, if you look through my visual diary from like 10 years ago, I think he always makes the list every year. He's always just doing cool stuff. Fun fact, I tried buying one of his books recently. Like, it's literally just a series of his illustrations and it goes for like $700. So yeah, he's not a bad guy to follow if you guys are looking to follow someone. Cool. So yeah, just to kind of back what I'm saying, this is not even, it's literally just the first 2 pages of my Pinterest. So obviously before this, I'd have to like create folders and stuff. Pinterest has completely spoiled me. It's the last thing I do before I go to bed. It's the first thing I do in the morning. Sometimes I just Pinterest for the sake of it. And you'll find, if you can see there, I just have some boards that are just called Yowza or Yikes, or that's nice. And it's weird how I always know where to find what. So, but like on a serious note, where I found this to be powerful was when I started working in an animation studio, which I'll go into detail on. Because I was part of the design team. Are there any animators in here before I throw a bit of shade? Okay, well, no shade. The fact that you're kind of here means that you might be one of the animators with eyes, and I'll go into that at some point. I'm sure you know what I mean by that. So working in an animation studio, you're obviously working with a lot of guys who are into physics and math and that sort of thing. And I was part of a small team of designers, and our job was basically to guide the art direction of stuff. And a big part of that was coming up with like treatment boards. So you'd literally sit, in a brainstorm and they'd be like, hey, we're doing work with Nestle. And it's always something you've never seen before. It's always something, because it's animation, people are always trying to push, boundaries and just come up with crazy stuff. So you'd almost need to have like this library of reference to pull from. And that's why I found this to like really help out. So every now and then I'd be like, well, here you go, there's this, there's that. And yeah, I guess my obsession with Pinterest, well, at the time it wasn't Pinterest, it was something called Notcart, which none of you probably heard of. But my obsession with like visual diaries really came through for me. Cool, then into my working years. So I guess a bit about me working. I go into detail about Luma because I think that was during my formative years. It was the one place I spent the most time and the one place I learned the most. I actually started out, I don't know if I should be mentioning names because there might be a bit of shade. I started out at a small agency and I was there for 4 months because I just could not take it. And you guys will find that as well. Don't feel bad if you're only at a place for like 2 or 3 months. If you don't vibe with it, walk away, find something that makes you happy. I was there for 4 months and was not liking it. But I'll tell you why I didn't like it. It's because I like being hands-on, you know, I like crafting stuff. And there my role was more of an art director role. So it was almost just saying, let's do this, and then outsourcing it to an illustrator or an animator to do the actual work. I actually wasn't getting stuck in, and I found that frustrating. So I packed my bags with no plan and knocked on Luma's door, and they're like, hey man, you're a web designer, what are we going to do with you? And yeah, they're like, look, we'll give you 3 months. If you can kind of crack this animation thing, then we'll keep you. If not, then you can go back to your web designing stuff. And yeah, you know, I was there for over 6 years, so we kind of hit it off. And yeah, I mean, I learned a lot of stuff there. I've gone so far off script, I can't even come back here, but whatever, I'm just going to freestyle it. And I think, you know, the one thing I learned at Luma, I mean, I'll show you guys my show reel after this, and I'll show you what, like, you know, every day was for me at Luma. But one thing that I was thankful for was they got me into character design. Because at some point, you know, remember I used to draw this Captain Planet and stuff as a kid, and then I went down this like weird film and web design like rabbit hole, and yeah, they finally got me to like do character designs for all these 3D models and stuff like that, and it started to build my confidence. I started to work on storyboards. Also compositing, digital compositing helped big time for me, and I'll show you that when I go into my illustrations. It helped me understand lighting, composition, drama, you know, tone, mood, that sort of thing. And yeah, at some point I was able to just draw on that for my illustrations. So yeah, let me show you guys the sort of stuff I was doing at Luma. Cool, so you see, it's quite a mix of like 3D, 2D, motion graphics. It was all over the show. But I think being a designer there basically allowed me to, I guess almost, I don't want to say lead, but like be a part of the beginning and the end of every single project. So I kind of had this oversight of how something should start out and how it should finish. I think being part of the design team, we were those people responsible with how this thing would roll out and how it would look. And yeah, that was cool. Right, so developing my own signature style of illustration. So yeah, into the meat and potatoes, about me and my work. Later in my career, I had a good sense of what it was I wanted to create and experiment with. I went back and took all the things I had learned over the years, the minimalist style of the characters like Samurai Jack, the intricacy of indelible patterns, the symmetry and geometry of the Bauhaus, the vibrant colors, the vibrant use of colors in the work of Thomas Hanukkah, and the expression and use of dramatic lighting that I learned at Luma. And I was able to create my own unique aesthetic. The following slides are examples of my illustrations and what I created over the years. Cool. So first up is a project I worked on recently. It's a personal project called Les Sapeurs. It's actually supposed to be a 3-part, you know, series. I've just worked on the first 2 characters. I don't know if you guys have heard about Les Sapeurs. So it's basically the subculture in Congo. They're also called the dandies of the Congo. And basically what happens is it's these people who basically live in like hectic poverty, but they prioritize designer clothing. So they stay in like, yeah, shanty towns and stuff. But these guys rock Armani, Dolce & Gabbana, and like the real stuff, they literally get it off like ships from Italy and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess weird placement of priorities, you might say. But I remember like coming across them in a book I got from my brother at some point, and I've since gotten more books on them. And just how they incorporate colors and patterns and how that juxtaposes against their impoverished backgrounds, for me, you know, creates the perfect picture. I think it's just the perfect contradiction. And that's what inspired this project. On to the next one. The one on the far right was an entry I'd done for an absolute vodka competition. I think the brief around that was just celebrating humanity. And yeah, I just thought I would interpret that with shapes, because that's what I do every day. I'm always exploring, you know, different compositions and different layouts with shapes to see what sort of faces and expressions and moods I can come up with. The image next to it would be Patrice Lumumba. He was a Congolese African leader. I really like the guy. I've watched many documentaries, read books about him, and I think it was his, I want to say 95th birthday or something like that, and I literally just illustrated that. Again, not commissioned. I was just exploring again with shapes and that sort of thing, and yeah, I managed to pull in quite a Congolese fan base, you know, after getting that art. These two were part of a 5-part illustration series. This was commissioned by an agency. So they'd seen my work and they kind of liked how, and to be brutally honest, at the time, I wasn't even aware of the term Afrofuturism. They were like, yeah, your stuff is like Afrofuturistic. And I was like, yeah, it is. You know? And they're like, can you create like an Afrofuturistic Big Five? And I was like, cool, on it. As long as I get to like experiment with shapes, expression, human form, and that sort of thing, I'm on it. And yeah, this was my interpretation of the buffalo and the rhino. And yeah, I quite enjoyed this one. Cool. The one on the right was, you know, a piece I created titled Creativity. This was just celebrating, you know, all the female illustrators I'd worked with and had come to know at that time in the industry. And I just wanted to create something cool just to, you know, say, hey, I see you and I appreciate working with you and bouncing ideas off you and that sort of thing. The one next to it was commissioned by a client. So they are a, what's the like official term? Organizational development agency. So they basically come in when there's conflict in the organization and they basically help resolve that and bring people together. So their name is Nabantu, which means with people. Z, you were also part of that exhibition, actually. So the brief was to basically come up with an artwork that somehow encompasses that, you know, that basically shows them bringing people together, or working with people and working their magic with people. And yeah, that was Mama Nabantu that I came up with for that. I'm a huge sports fan, super diehard Kobe Bryant fan. And recently for Mamba Day, I did that artwork there. And then obviously Colin Kaepernick, you know, so influential right now. I also did this artwork a few years ago just to kind of commemorate him. I think I called it Africa's with Cap, just to let him know that Africa is also kneeling with him and down with him. Cool. And then on the far right, I don't know if you guys have heard of Thelonious Monk, famous jazz musician. So I love jazz, but I also love hip hop. And I also love Enya, but don't tell anyone else that. I'm always listening to whatever. Like people always assume, you know, I have to get super deep and like listen to like leaves falling and stuff, you know, to illustrate. Nah, you know, it's whatever's going on. If it's Migos I'm listening to, I'll listen to that. Sometimes it's like old jazz that I listen to. So I was just really going through like this old jazz moment. And yeah, I just really wanted to see how far I could push like shapes and see if I could still get like a recognizable form purely using shapes. And I think that was one of my earlier artworks that actually started to like define my art style. Yeah, I think what else I enjoyed about that was the use of light. I think this was like smack bang in the middle of my time at Luma. And I'd learned about room light and like key lighting and stuff like that. And yeah, I literally just threw it all into this. And then I deliberately did certain stuff. Like I'd have like actual perspective, but then I'd have forced perspective. I was just messing around and it ended up there. And I was like, hey, that looks okay. And called it a day. Yeah, closer to me here we have a portrait that I've done of Esther Mahlangu. You'd all know her, the famous indelible painter. At the time, and that's another thing, when I started out earlier on, I'd just do stuff because I felt like, you know, I'd literally get out and be like, ooh, Esther Mahlangu, I really love her stuff, you know, let me do something there. So at the time, there was like no plan of her receiving this artwork or anything along those lines. Then literally a year later, someone had seen the artwork, and I think the NSA were hosting her for some event, and they actually gifted her with this. So that was like a nice little full circle moment for me with that. Cool. So yeah, now on to some like key projects that I'd like to highlight. The first of which would be the Powerpuff Girls Art Factory. So this was actually hosted by Cartoon Network Africa. They basically got a few artists, flew us over to Cape Town, and the whole idea was to get us to reinterpret the Powerpuff Girls however we wanted to. So I'm obviously Ndebele, took a lot of influence from that, and I basically came up with this Ndebele Powerpuff Girl. And yeah, I guess it was well received. The prints were sold, and proceeds from that went to a charity called Rock Girls, who operate out of Cape Town. Cool. Then this one is a fun one that's still very much in the works. So I've got a good friend of mine, Raphael Griffiths, who's actually a writer. Some years ago, he came to me and he was like, hey, everyone's always writing about Shaga, and it's Shaga this and Shaga that. And Zwide he always comes across as like this villain, and no one really knows who Zwide is, if he's not playing the villain. How's about we come up with a nice, graphic novel about him, and maybe even roll out an animation? I was like, sounds good to me. I forgot to mention, he was like, yeah, but it should be like anime inspired. And I was like, got me, let's do it. So we're still working on that. We recently showed it at Comic-Con. When was Comic-Con? Last weekend. So we're still in the process of getting funding for it to actually roll out the full thing. But we're looking to have a graphic novel and the animation. And next up is just a little teaser that I animated to kind of help, because we're always on the road with this. We'll go meet with Disney, go meet with Netflix, so we need something to show them, like a proof of concept. And that's what this is. Right, then on to one of my more recent projects. So the collaboration that we did with Fly Fair. It was a bit of a weird brief, if I remember correctly. They're like, what does heritage mean to you? Or, something, very agency like that. And I remember at the time, I think a week before I got the brief, I think I'd flown to Durban for something. I don't even know why I thought this, but I remember like literally looking up and I was like, hey, there's actually like a nice diverse mix of people. If ever there was a time you could capture the Rainbow Nation, it would literally be in this vessel right now, because it's different people from all walks, different shades and colors, different shapes. And I was like, you know what, I'll bring that across, and that's what I'll actually, create here. And again, using shapes, using repetition, I decided to throw in their corporate colors just to make them happy. Clients like that sort of stuff. And yeah, I was able to come up with this tileable pattern. And then these are just some images of how it actually rolled out in the planes. Cool. And then my most recent collaboration. So this actually dropped last week, I think, or Heritage Day. So Freedom of Movement reached out to myself and a few other illustrators to basically get us to interpret our heritage, our culture, which would then go on a t-shirt. So being in Ndebele, it was a no-brainer for me. I basically, created this Ndebele character, and I tried to incorporate this Ndebele village in the background, because that's another thing that they're quite big on. It's about adventure, movement. I think they even have their little, is it a Range Rover, a Land Rover? It's their thing, and they asked me to incorporate that in the illustration as well. But yeah, I had fun with this one, and yeah, this is how it actually turned out as a t-shirt, which is available online at the moment. So I actually went over to the store to get my I was about to say my copy of the t-shirt, my t-shirt. And yeah, it was cool. It was a fun experience. Took photos with the guys, and it was just cool to see my work, interpreted on a t-shirt, because I actually haven't done any clothing collaborations. So this was my first, and yeah, it was a fun one to do. Cool. Then next was Comedy Central. So this was like smack bang in the middle of like lockdown, and nothing was happening. and comedians were struggling because no one was going to comedy bars because no one was going anywhere. So Comedy Central and Savannah reached out, and they basically asked if we could do this weird concept where they would film the comedians against green screen, and they basically get different illustrators to illustrate the story that's being told. So I had this weird story. I guess it's not really that weird because we live in South Africa. This is what happens. I'm sure you guys all heard about the doom pastors who were spraying people. You know, prophets of doom, I think is what they were called. And that was the story I had to kind of come up with. So I had to create this prophet of doom type character. When I think back, I've actually put this project right in the back of my mind because it was painful. Because initially it was supposed to be a 2-minute, like, in fact, first it was supposed to just be illustrations. Then they're like, hey, you can animate. Don't worry, it's just 2 minutes of animation. And then it ended up being 8 minutes. And I think that was the last time I worked like that. I think there was the one time I got up to work at 4 in the morning and I only went to bed at like 11 the following day. And I was like, okay, nah, I'm too old for this, can't do it anymore. But by all means, guys, do that. It builds character, you know. So yeah, this is just a bit, I basically had to cut like a nice little short reel or teaser for it, and this is it. Right, and then Nedbank, also another weird brief, which kind of stopped, but typical agency vibes. So I think the brief for this was that, Nedbank felt like they were being left behind in the dust because F&B were coming up with all this amazing tech, and ABSA had revamped itself, and they wanted to really position themselves as this new digital bank. And yeah, they had all these amazing features and stuff, but they basically first wanted to come up with a countdown timer, because that's another thing. They basically launched Nedbank, which already exists, but they wanted to launch it as this new bank. So to generate buzz around that, they got a few illustrators to basically create a countdown. So from 7 all the way down to 1. And then they got us to reinterpret the Nedbank logo and reveal it on a certain day. So these are just some of the animated numbers that I created. And yeah, I guess Afrofuturism is still a key word, a buzzword. They were like, incorporate some of that stuff you do. And yeah, that was my interpretation of it. Cool. And then, yeah, some of you may not know this about me, but I'm such a big advocate of pushing children's literacy. So to date, I think I've worked on 6 children's books. This is just some of the books I've worked on. I think the first time I ever touched like a children's book, I don't know if you guys have heard of something called Book Dash. Yeah. They were like, hey, come through. And I was like, what is it? And they're like, you need to create a book in 12 hours. I was like, I don't know, eh? Like we'll fly you out to Cape Town and you stay in a hotel. And I was like, okay, cool, free trip. And yeah, that was my first Book Dash. And yeah, to be honest, it's rough because you basically have to push out an illustration every hour. And there's literally someone there cracking the whip every hour to say, get that illustration out. And that's another thing, you don't have time. It's not like they send you the script beforehand and then you can like think about it and stuff. It's like, all right, we're here, this is your team. You meet your team members for the first time and you're like, let's go. So I don't know, it's weird. It's like, I don't know, I might just be weird like that, but I really enjoyed the challenge of it. And I think I've done 3 Book Dashes, thinking of doing a 4th. This actually wasn't from Book Dash. This was a collaboration with Ethnic Kids and Wimpy. So I think if you bought like a certain kid's meal, you'd actually get this book that I'd illustrated. This was actually one of the books I did with Book Dash. Yeah, so I just really enjoy like creating children's content. At some point I worked on an animated children's series of like African tales with Kwese. They're no longer in business, but this was like 2018. Yeah, and that's one of the characters I created for them. And recently I worked with the College of Magic in Cape Town. and they basically came out with like this book to help teach kids magic. And these were some of the characters that I created for that. Cool, and that's my story, guys. Yeah, you know the usual stuff. You can check out my Instagram, check out my website if you want to see my latest projects. But yeah, I guess this would be your time to ask me any questions. Yeah, over to you guys. Yeah. I just added a few thought starters because, you know, I've had some crowds that are like, just look at me when it's Q&A time. Not saying that's who you guys are, but, you know, if you like, feel free to bum some of my questions. I don't mind.